shooting video, thought that it would be maybe trying to vindicate himself and saying goodbye. He did that, except as we know now that he opened a manila envelope and drew out a pistol, waved people back who were rising, try to, yelling, "Bud, stop, don't," and then shot himself, put the gun in his mouth, and of course he was killed instantly. All of this captured on video and on still pictures, and so television stations and newspapers around the state as well as around the country, but we focused our case study on the stations and newspapers in Pennsylvania and what decisions they made. And only one station continued to use the unedited tape from beginning to end. I think 2 other stations had used parts of it, but nearly everybody else independently decided to stop it before the shot was fired. And one station out of the 20 in Pennsylvania that Penn State researchers checked at the time did not use any video at all. In newspapers, which is where I was concerned, that we had a variety of stills to work from. The most used, I think, was a picture of him with the pistol in his right hand, left hand waving people back. I call that the stand back picture, and we use that at Inquirer. But we also used a picture of him with the gun in his mouth, and that was on the front page. And inside we showed a picture of him, his body slumped on the floor. This is black and white, so it wasn't gore, and it's taken from a distance. That was not a particularly gory picture. So those are the 3 we used. There were a few others, but including a moment of impact where his head seems to explode. We never even considered using that. But our photo editors felt strongly that this is essentially a local story and an extraordinary suicide, which generally is not a big news story, that we should use 2 pictures on the front, the stand back picture and the pistol in the mouth, and inside the body slumped. I do, in retrospect, regret that we used the picture of the gun in the mouth. A lot of people told us the next day that when it's on the front page of the paper, they can't censor this for their children. They probably were offended by the picture too, but most people were speaking about our kids see that and we don't want them to see it. And incidentally, the same sort of reaction came to the station that showed the unexpurgated tape of the effect on children of seeing this. So these were some of the things that we were concerned about. We even though there was a snowstorm at the time and a lot of papers didn't get delivered promptly, we still got 500 phone calls the next day, which was an unusual number. And my opinion is that whether you agree with them or not, that when the switchboard lights up, you need to think about what you did and try to, if you haven't already, try to determine whether maybe that was the right course. A couple of people in our newsroom had expressed concern about the gun in the mouth. But I think our feeling at the time was that this was our state senator, it was in public, it's a local story, it is a major story, and we should use it. But I think that I would certainly not use on the front page and probably wouldn't use that picture at all. I think that the virtue of the stand back picture, you get the feeling of impending violence, but without the actual scene itself. And I think sometimes we ought to spare our readers or viewers of the actual scene if we can suggest it in a way that is not itself offensive. That seemed to be a better course.
The parents' concerns about their children seeing the paper come up a lot. And how much should we really worry about that issue?
About the people reacting?
Parents wanting to shield their children from either graphic violence or graphic sex in the newspaper.
Well, another case study in the book is about the Spokane mayor, and editor Steve Smith of the Spokesman Review, the paper that ran the story about the mayor's sexual involvement with younger men. People complained to him about that, and he said, well, we don't edit the paper for children, but we recognize that some children will see it, but I think that we would be really hamstrung in trying to tell the news of the day if it were written exclusively or as if it were only going to be read by children. So we're probably a PG on stories like that rather than G, but we do have to pull our punches, I think. That there's question of that you drive away the readers if you are too explicit. We have to constantly balance our responsibility to our audience of not upsetting them, offending them, driving them away, versus our responsibility to tell the news about what actually happened. So I think that what I advocate teaching is two things. One is learn to recognize what is likely to offend. And so I try in writing the book to give the students the benefit of my experience, things that I learned from trial and error. And frankly, I didn't realize how incendiary the picture of the gun in the mouth would be. I mean, I knew that some people would be bothered, but the degree surprised me. And the second thing, of course, would be now that you know you're pretty sure it's going to offend somebody, are we justified in running it? Is there another way to tell the story? And sometimes the answer is we're going to offend them, but we think it's important. But I think those are things that are carefully thought out in advance so that you anticipate the reaction and you feel confident that you're still doing the right thing.
Placement seems to be a big issue when it comes to these kinds of photos, because I get the sense a lot of parents feel like if it's on the front, that kids are not that likely to go paging through the paper, but they'll see what's on the front page. And I know maybe worthwhile talking about the American soldier who was dragged through the streets in Mogadishu, because I remember reading that when that photo moved across the wires, that editors were having a meeting at the time, and they were quickly polled about how they would handle it. And I think about 1/3 said front page in color, 1/3 said, black and white inside, and 1/3 said they wouldn't use it at all. And I always think about that as that sort of epitomizes, what's sort of difficult about making ethical decisions is to have such a perfect split about how to handle a piece of news. So if you could talk about the background of that case and how you think that one should be handled.
Yes, I'm in the group that think it should be run. There was a major local story at the time that dominated our front page. We did run it inside. I think that if it had been a normal day, we probably would have run it somewhere on the front. But that was a story that A, we knew it would offend, B, we thought it was extremely important.
I was thinking maybe for the tape, if you could just describe the background.
Yes. We were trying to help the people of Somalia who, in a drought and in a famine, sending supplies in there, but the country had no functioning government, and there was constant battle between the warlords. In this context, our soldiers got caught up in a firefight, and Black Hawk helicopter shot down, and that's one of the soldiers in the helicopter was killed in an ensuing gunfight, and his body was dragged through the street with people jeering in Mogadishu. And this influenced, I think, that the picture and, of course, the event itself. The President Clinton decided that we would pull our troops out, and that we wanted to help in distributing food, that we also didn't want our soldiers killed, that there was tremendous hostility to our being there among certain groups. And so the fact that it was later shown to have influenced policy only, I think, reinforces our belief that we did the right thing in running the picture. that sometimes people have to see things that are troubling to them in order for us to tell them here's what's going on. It's a fine line, and I think in the Dwyer case we probably went over that line in my retrospective. In the Mogadishu case, I don't think we did.
Well, what about the counter argument, though, that a photo like that is so inflammatory in a way that as soon as people see it, maybe they stop looking at the bigger policy issue and just say, well, no, we don't want that to happen to any of our soldiers. Let's get them all out of there. And so it winds up, it's kind of like, if you show a photo of a plane crash, it obscures the fact that most planes land safely. You know what I mean? That you're seeing the very worst of it, and that's what creates this deep impression in people's minds. And then so it's hard for them to retain a more nuanced or balanced or complex view.
Well, I think that's a judgment that people had to make. We're giving them the information. I don't think that we should shy from running that picture because people might be very, very angry about that, and maybe Clinton should have stayed in Somalia. I don't know, but the fact is that there was a lot of public pressure that let's get out. We don't want just as you said, and that influenced policy. But I don't think that's manipulative on our part if we say, well, we're going to pull our punches because it may be a policy that we would not approve of. I think we have to be neutral on that and say that we give them the information and the people decide ultimately what they want to do.
So while we're on this subject, I was also thinking about the difference between local upsetting photographs and ones from far away. And one instance in particular that epitomizes this issue is the Saturday Times ran an accident photo several years ago. It was a Penn State student. She was crossing Garner Street at Beaver Avenue. She got hit by a bus. The photo was not graphic at all. You could just see her legs, and that was about it. The day before, they ran a really bloody photo from a suicide bombing in Jerusalem. And no uproar. The switchboard did not light up about the suicide bombing photo, and it did light up about the Penn State student photo. So what does that tell us about how people respond to the newspaper in terms of making decisions about those kinds of photos?
Yeah, I remember that photograph of the school bus, and you could see rescue workers working over what presumably was the student's body. And I have shown it to my ethics classes at Penn State, and as an example of how a picture that's not particularly gory is still offensive because it's local. The point you made, it's absolutely true. Local, and Sherman Williams, the photo editor of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, speaks to that in my book about how that local does make a difference. That often people will know, the readers will know the person involved and will react personally to that. And I think that the point you made about there's a very gory picture from Jerusalem that attracted almost no reaction, and then there's a local picture, not gory, but symbolic. I mean, you can tell it's a tragedy that occurred, and it did attract a lot. So this is just one of the many factors I think that journalists have to consider in just making their decisions. And it goes into the first part of that two-step decision-making process is to what degree do you think people will be offended? Then you go on to the other questions. Do they really need to see this from a news point of view? Yeah. My view on the bus, if they had anticipated the kind of reaction they would get, there wasn't a whole lot of argument for using that picture. It just simply was not a remarkable picture under any circumstances.
So is there a meaningful distinction to be made also between pictures that have to do with public policy issues and sort of a public tragedy versus a private one, that there are things we need to think about and decide when it comes to the photo from Somalia as opposed to a car accident, there's no real public policy issue there. Although I suppose you could always argue, and I know people do make this argument, that every photo of an accident is a reminder for people to be careful. And so in that sense, it's useful.
Right, and there's validity to that. I think it can be overused. We simply want to get a picture in because it's a remarkable picture, and maybe we then make this is not the way I think decisions ought to be made, but we're human, and if we really want to run this picture because it's such a spectacular picture, and then we back up and try to justify it, it's not good decision making. So while it can be argued that it does affect public policy for the better, showing how accidents can happen and how they could have been prevented. I can recall the Stanley Foreman picture of the fire escape collapse in Boston. Shows the two people, a 19-year-old woman and about a 3 or 4-year-old girl that she was babysitting, plunging. The woman was killed. The girl fell on top of her, and a lot of people, of course, objected to that. I think that the fact that it really showed the danger of fire escapes, in this case, had not been inspected in a long time, that we needed to tighten up the laws. In Boston, indeed, tighten it up, and other cities followed suit. So there is validity to that. But I would also say that, to answer another part of your question, that if something is private as opposed to a public person, an ordinary person involved in a tragic thing, that people are going to react very strongly. So local and private versus somewhere else in public are two distinctive factors that journalists need to learn to factor in making their determination of whether people will be offended or not. I can recall at the Enquirer, we had a dramatic picture of a little girl who had been in a car wreck being extricated by the firefighters, a heroic thing, and she was alive. But that night, she died. And our night crew was alert to check on her condition and get the fact that she died. But unfortunately, they should have reconsidered the photograph at the time. And we caught a lot of flack for running that picture because the girl died. If she had lived, I think people would have agreed this is a great picture. But since she died, in their view, and again, something we have to be concerned about is that this changes the situation. So these are things that the dramatic picture of the firefighter with the mangled and dead body of a child in Oklahoma City, defied all of those rules, except that in most cases it was not local. I mean, say that we ran it in Philadelphia. People understood. I mean, we got virtually no complaints about running that picture. I do not see myself a hero in this thing, but the news desk was saying, but we're not going to run this picture. And I said, oh, we are. This is really a good picture, and it encapsulates the entire story right here. You can look at the fireman's face, just disgusted or forlorn that this happened, and he was not able to do anything. And so we occasionally there are situations like that. When I asked Sherman Williams at Milwaukee about that, and he said, yeah, so that the enormity of the thing, that people understood. Now, if it was just a single death, they would not have accepted that picture, in my opinion.
So what about this? I got a complaint 1 year after Oklahoma City when we ran the same photo on the 1 year anniversary. And people said, the person who called, it's an interesting point. She said, I understand why it was important and newsworthy right when it happened, but why do we need to see it again a year later? Do you have a response to that?
Yes, I think that that it ought to be a part of our process to think about what we do on anniversaries. If it's a local event, that the family is still here, and we had to consider the effect on that family of saying this notorious automobile accident, which say 5 kids were killed after the senior prom, that there are going to be 5 families that are going to be seared once again by this. I think that we had to be very careful on anniversary pictures and stories. And I can recall the second plane crashing into the tower on 9/11. Did they have to show it over and over and over that day? I mean, clearly not everybody would have seen it live, but I think that they learned a lot from that. The television networks, that you don't show something like that over and over and over.
Well, speaking of 9/11, I mean, if you had been making decisions in the newsroom about the photos of people jumping out the windows in the World Trade Center,
yes.
How would you have handled those? Because one thing I remember, first, those did run on inside pages, and they pretty much only ran once and not again. And the European papers ran those photos much more liberally than the American papers did. And again, it's an issue of distance.
Distance and culture, probably, but although I don't presume to be an expert on that, but they were reading their customers differently maybe than we read ours. But I would have run that picture inside as the New York Times did, and it is in the book in chapter 18 or 19 about would you run this picture, and I think that I remember Tom Brokaw saying afterwards, we should have covered that aspect of it. And indeed, they should have. I mean, this is an aspect as horrific as it is, people making a choice to die by jumping rather than by burning. It simply told a story that was horrific from the beginning. I mean, there's no way to spare the people of what happened that way. But I don't think it need to be on the front page because we were trying to cover, there were other images that were more descriptive of the whole event, but somewhere that's an aspect of the story that had to be covered.
Well, how much should we worry about the reactions of specific families to a tragic piece of news when we're trying to communicate with this mass audience? And I think of the recent controversy over the photo of the soldier killed in Iraq. Where the AP went to the family to tell them that they were going to run this photo, and the family asked them not to, and they went ahead and ran it anyway. And then there's this debate, like why this photo is important. What do you think about that issue?
Well, I think that sometimes we, not in a callous way, but we do disregard what the family said. I'll back up and say that, say you're a local paper the size of the Center Daily Times, and you want to we're a 1-year anniversary and show the car wreck that killed 5 local young people, that I think you do worry about the families a lot more than you would in this particular case, where I think that they were trying to let the family know that we're going to run the picture. In the process, they got the request, please don't run it, and they ultimately decided they would run it anyway. And I can see where they can make that decision, and I can see where it would be unpopular. But I think that sometimes that happens.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should leave the world of photojournalism decisions. The Bud Dwyer case also calls to mind changing standards when it comes to covering suicides. How, in your experience, how has coverage of suicides changed, over the decades that you've been involved in the news business? And where do you think we are now?
Yeah. Well, I think suicide is a very difficult question, and it's on several levels. I think that I can flatly say that it's generally not a big story. That it's tragic, but rarely is it made a big deal over. The Dwyer case, leaving aside the question about that particular picture, certainly met all the requirements for being an exception to the rule. It was public, it involved a public official, one who had been convicted. Everything said this is outside that normal restraint about suicide. And but so unless a person is extraordinarily important, whose passing from this earth needs to be noted as for its news value, and unless the suicide is public or both, generally suicide is not a story much at all. And so, but the question then comes up, I don't think you should glamorize the suicide if a person stands on a building for hours, draws a crowd, and then jumps. I think you got to be very subdued about it. We don't want to have copycats. And there's a good report out by experts on how the media can help, and they are very concerned if we make the committing of suicide appear to be glamorous or a reaction to a single bad event. The example they use is boy 10 kills himself over bad grades. Their point is that nearly everybody who commits suicide has a mental illness that is either undiagnosed or untreated or both, and that they also don't think we should run a lot of details about how a suicide took place. I have no trouble accepting restraint on suicide, and there's one that I continue to debate among myself and talk with other journalists about is that in running a routine obituary that happens to be a suicide, do you put the cause of death in there? A lot of papers don't. And I worry about that because a lot of people know that the person shot himself, and they may figure the paper suppresses other news as well. A group of newspapers, community papers in New England years ago decided they would say cause of death and suicide. And what they found was that adhering to the wishes of the family, the medical examiner would not include the cause of death. So they were foiled by the authorities, and nobody seemed to appreciate what they're trying to do is just simply be honest. They give other causes of death, so they should give this one as well. There is no answer to that I've found that is because I know from personal experience how how traumatizing it is for a person in the family to have it in the paper, even though friends already know, but to have in the paper that their son or daughter committed suicide is makes a big difference.
But what about the argument that that not reporting suicide as cause of death kind of perpetuates the stigma in the same way that not reporting sex crimes, victims of sex crimes, perpetuates the stigma, and that conversely reporting that suicide is the cause of death promotes awareness and leads to may prevent suicides down the road?
Yeah, well, the experts that I consulted in writing my book, that they feel that we ought to write about the phenomenon of suicide, how to recognize warning signs, what to do about it if you think someone is close to you is suicidal, that we ought to write about the problem rather than about specific individuals. Again, this is caused us to kind of shift gears. It's not the usual way we think. We're focused on an event. But I think there's a lot of merit to that.
And so what about sex crimes? I know, Michael Gartner famously argues that, we should break with the tradition of withholding the names of victims of sex crimes. Geneva Overholser has made that argument as well. How do you feel about that?
Well, Geneva's paper in Des Moines Register Tribune won a Pulitzer Prize for telling the story of a woman who had been raped. But she gave her permission. It wouldn't have been written if she hadn't given her permission. And I think there are exceptions that most of us will make, that if the person involved, the victim, wants to go public, that we would not be bothered by reporting it. We're not going to deny it. Now, if the victim is underage and the parents are not, and that comes up in a case study in the book, I think you had to think twice about that. The parents may not be, they're not making the decision about themselves, but about another party, and they may not be aware of the effects of publicity that we in the business might be aware of. So I think that generally speaking, though, that I'm on the side, and say so in my textbook, that while I see merit in the argument to the contrary, that I think that I would continue routinely not to run victims of sex crimes because of the stigma and because I think, as a matter of public policy, to the extent I allow myself to think about, is that it will only cause more rapes to not be reported. I think that is intuitive. You can figure that out for yourself. You don't need empirical evidence. But I certainly think we have an obligation to men accused of rape to follow their cases through and to be very clear that they've been, if they're acquitted, to make sure that gets prominently reported as well. But it is, again, it is not a perfect world, and the sex crime identification is one that has no perfect answer.